Well, thank you for the opportunity and thank you all for coming. I'm going to try to draw a line through really a wide range of projects that my group has been working on over the last few years and um, some transdisciplinary ideas that a couple of groups have been co-developing over this time too. It's really quite a lot of pieces and there's far too many people to acknowledge and thank. I've just listed really the key people over on the left, and I'll try to highlight especially all the early career scientists who have really done the hard work, many of the results that I'm going to talk about. This work has been a partnership that's sort of an overlapping Venn diagram of work between the Likely Suspects framework of the Missing Salmon Alliance, the Eco-Wings project funded by NERC, part of Eco-Wind, and some projects through a new MASTS working group on migration and prey energyscapes, which if you are inspired by this talk and would like to get involved with, you still can, and we would welcome it. So I'm going to try to set the stage in terms of two problems in what I think of as conservation oceanography, where we're talking about salmon and seabirds and plankton. And then I will try to take you through the place where using sort of standard large-scale tools for modeling and prediction leaves us, which is really quite depressing when we think about the 21st century and where climate change is bringing the North Atlantic. But then I'd like to bring in a completely different line of thinking that really comes out of my reading in social anthropology, people like Anna Singh and others I'll mention as we go along, where we'll talk about matsutake mushrooms as an analogy, and where I hope and pray that all of you consider argument by analogy to be a valid form of argument. And then we'll see whether that leads us to some pictures of resilience inside the big picture of climate change and despair. So for a start, let's talk about wild salmon. In the UK, the marine return rate of wild salmon is about half what it was in the 1970s. So if 10% of the outgoing post-smolts came back as adults in the 1970s, it's like 5% now. But this marine survival decline is not really directly the part of the life cycle or the part of the habitat where managers can intervene. If managers are going to intervene to help a salmon river, it's going to be in the watershed or perhaps at the coast. So there's a mismatch there. As part of that, we've been working on a whole life cycle model of salmon growth and survivorship, including size-dependent carryover effects from river to ocean and from ocean to river. And we're embedding that in a decision support tool. You can see one version of this still under development on the website of the Missing Salmon Alliance, where a manager can try to create a representation of their salmon population, drag the sliders around to see, oh, if I could intervene in the survival of the juveniles, what downstream effect would that have on the population? But as part of that, we have to be able to put some slider representing marine conditions, the baseline for marine survival, into this tool. It has to be relevant to specific rivers, and we'd like it to have historical and future context because things are changing over time. And if you're looking out to the future, you need to know where are we going to be in the 2040s compared with where we were in the 80s and are now. But how, as marine scientists, do we fill in something like that? How can we create that? This is the food chain supporting even juvenile wild salmon in Southern Europe, which includes us. So we're all on the same page. The primary production, the forests that drive this whole food chain are single-cell phytoplankton, mainly. Other protists are part of that community too. And those are all eaten by a broad size spectrum of zooplankton, from tiny little things like Oithona, barely visible, to a 3 millimeter long Calanus, often considered the keystone species of the North Atlantic subpolar gyre because they are very lipid rich and they're good energetic food for everything bigger than them, and euphausids, krill, and amphipods. That whole size spectrum is eaten by a range of widely distributed forage fish, small pelagic fish like sandeel and blue whiting and herring, sprat. And those fish are then eaten by the postmolts, who also sometimes eat the zooplankton directly. So it's a very long food chain, and it's a very complicated food chain that we need to be able to simplify if we're going to make large-scale projections. Now, parallel to that, second problem, UK's breeding seabirds have declined also substantially since the 1980s. This has been particularly acute in Scotland. There's that factor of 2 decline again. It's shared across many species, and there too, it seems to have a lot to do with the food available to them. So the sandeels that many seabirds rely on are getting smaller over time. And we want to know, as oceanographers, why is this happening? Is it going to continue? What proxy variables could we use to make a big map of the future of sandeels? Now, this is essentially the same food chain. From an oceanographer's point of view, it's the same food chain that branches off at the top. The postsmolts are generally eating fish larvae. The North Sea seabirds are generally eating larger sandeels and other forage fish, but it's the same species, the same populations, and the same dependencies on the plankton. And that's one of the reasons we've been able to construct this sort of Venn diagram of research, where we take work and insights back and forth between seabird problems and salmon problems. But the news isn't good from this work, I have to say. I think we've made a lot of technical progress, but the picture that it gives us is not what we would hope. So here's our view, the level of that food chain where we're able to make the most progress, I think, using existing data sets. Longest running survey of plankton conditions on a large scale. It's an amazing technology. It's towed behind ships of opportunity. It's been running since the 1960s. And it actually fishes for zooplankton on these lengths of treated silk. So it's essentially a fishing net for zooplankton with a 1/4 millimeter mesh, which are then hand counted by the Marine Biological Association and then made available to the community. It's a really amazing resource. So work by Emma Tilsley et al. That was published last year in ICES shows that when you take all of this data, you take all of the, you grid it by, I think these are 1 degree bins. We take only the bins where we can construct a 40+ year time series that extends back to before 1980 and after 2000 in order to capture both sides of a regime shift that people often talk about. And then when we plot the log linear trend over that time, almost everywhere we see major declines, 10 to 20% declines per decade when we convert into energy units the variety of zooplankton that are commonly found in sandeel diet and the diet of other small pelagic fish. So 10 to 20% per decade sustained over 40 years. So in that context, 50% declines in breeding success or in marine returns is not really surprising. We have a pretty good clue that we're on the right track because there's a regional correlation between the zooplankton time series and salmon marine returns. This is also in Emma's work that was published last year. So there's 9 rivers around the UK and northern France where we have time series of marine returns. The ones in the west, in green dots there, cluster together. They show a very strong decline, which correlates, including interannual variability, with zooplankton off to the west. The one North Sea river, the returns correlate well with zooplankton in the North Sea. And then in the English Channel, there's a fairly flat line of marine returns and zooplankton over time. So that regional correlation makes us feel like we've actually found not just a statistical proxy, but something directly relevant in the changing base of the marine food web and its implications for this large mobile predator. But let's take those historic declines and consider where they are expected to go in the future. So here, this is work also led by Emma in prep right now as part of EcoWings, where we're working with the National Oceanography Center, putting together 3 downscaled projections using the same model system, AMM7, that gives us a detailed 25-year reanalysis of ocean conditions around the UK. So the details of the temperature and salinity fields don't matter. I put them there mainly to highlight that it's that flavor of marine research where we construct a big gridded fields of the variables that we can model in 3D, which is things like temperature, salinity, nutrients, mixed layer depth, as opposed to the detailed ecology. And then we try to build statistical models that relate those conditions to the individual creatures of interest. So we have 3 random forest models, and by we, again, I really mean Emma, 3 random forest models for a collection of small copepods, Calanus finmarchicus, that large lipid-rich hero of the North Atlantic, and Calanus helgolandicus, which is very similar to finmarchicus, maybe slightly smaller on average, but a very similar creature, just with different ecology. So we get realistic distributions. You can see the small copepods in helgolandicus, they are concentrated in the shelf seas, finmarchicus in the northern waters that intrude into the North Sea in spring. And then we can construct future time slices and predict the future of the baseline for that food web that supports salmon and seabirds. And it's down, 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 wherever we look. All of this random forest copepod modeling suggests that the combination of physical, chemical, biological drivers that correlate, that explain habitat in the past, are going to shift in ways that mean the recent declines we've seen historically will continue. And it essentially, in these projections, wipes out this entire planktonic food chain over the whole area of interest. So it would be really great to find some reason to think this is not the end of the story. Because if this is the end of the story, yes, it's a practical, usable result, but it also makes one wonder, why are we trying to conserve wild salmon rivers if they're going to be wiped out at sea? Why are we trying to develop compensation schemes for seabirds in relation to energy development if the sandeels they depend on are going to have nothing to eat? We have to hope, we have to trust in some way that there is more to this story than this. So let's talk about problems of scale. Now, I'll just say as context that my background is both is a combination of oceanography and comparative religion, as in literature and anthropology. And what I'm trying to do in this talk is explain the way I think about the complexities of the marine science, the way I actually think about it in my head, bouncing back and forth between these 2 sides of my academic training, as opposed to the way that I usually explain it or pretend that I'm thinking about it in an actual science context. This is kind of experimental. So if it feels very choppy, I apologize, but I'm just going to carry on anyway. So here's a book that starting around COVID times, I've been thinking about a lot, and that led to a really wonderful workshop for about 15 or 20 of us a couple of years ago on some of the ideas I'm about to talk about. This book, The Mushroom at the End of the World, is a modern classic in environmental humanities by Anna Singh. And it's a very multidimensional story centered on matsutake mushrooms. Now, just to summarize, a whole sprawling story that goes in all sorts of unpredictable directions very quickly. Matsutake mushrooms grow wild in disturbed pine forests. They have to be disturbed pine forests. And that means that the ruined, completely um, decimated, clear-cut forests of the US Pacific Northwest are actually quite good habitat for Matsutake mushrooms. And in these ruined forests, very marginal human communities, often very ephemeral ones, people who are living in the forest, or working in the forest, camping in the forest for all sorts of reasons of their own, forage for the mushrooms. They all have their own ways, they all have their own places of finding them. And then gradually, through many steps, these mushrooms make their way into global supply chains, and they end up as beautifully packaged, high-value commodities in Japan. It's a quite remarkable story. It's hard to figure out how it generalizes. And I think that's sort of the point. I think that's largely the point of this book, actually. Here's a passage from the book that I'm just going to read because I find it so useful for thinking about marine ecology. Singh writes, "We have a problem with scale. A rush of stories cannot be neatly summed up. Its scales do not nest neatly. They draw attention to interrupting geographies and tempos. These interruptions elicit more stories. This is the rush of stories' power as a science. Yet it is just these interruptions that step out of the bounds of most modern science, which demands the possibility for infinite expansion without changing the research framework." Now, maybe in the discussion, we can get into this a little bit. I think that there's some really interesting community dynamics within science and allied fields about the expectation or the possibility of infinite expansion, of scaling up your idea, scaling up your case study. And depending on where each of you is coming from, you might think, why scale up? Why is there this expectation that a story needs to be infinitely generalizable? Or you might think, well, of course we need to scale up. What we need is global projections. We need large scale results that are policy actionable. So maybe we can get into some of that complexity there, but that complexity is exactly what Singh, as an anthropologist working alongside scientists, is interested in. And it's one of the lessons that she's drawing from the absolute weirdness of how very small scale idiosyncratic bits of biology and human social relations intrude onto this global supply chain of Matsutake mushrooms. I think that a lot of our stories, our ecological stories in the ocean, are like this. So here I'm going to start jumping around even more than already, but I want to, by pastiche, I suppose, paint a picture of the ways in which I think the food chain supporting seabirds and salmon have the same feeling as the mushroom story. So here is some work in progress by the MAST's working group on migration and energy scapes, where the Sea Track project based in Norway, along with a map that we put together through a residency last spring, where we've mapped together the winter position of the kittiwakes that breed in summer on the Isle of May in the Scottish North Sea. So first of all, notice that it's the kittiwake colored dots, the dark gray and white ones that are the kittiwakes here. And notice that a lot of them stay around the UK. All of these positions are approximate, by the way, because of the technology. So they're not necessarily exactly where on land they appear to be. Many of them stay around our side of the Atlantic, but the majority of them by December seem to be found over on the other side of the Atlantic, over really quite a large stretch of ocean. And it matches quite well the accumulated CPR data on large zooplankton. So far, we've added together large copepods, euphausids, and amphipods. There's a couple of other groups that we'll add to that. Nobody really expects there to be large zooplankton in the surface waters of the open ocean in the mid-Atlantic in December, and yet there they are, able to be sampled by the CPR. And there are the kittiwakes, which we know from a lit review, here and in the Arctic do actually eat zooplankton, although you classically imagine them eating sandeel. And who wouldn't rather eat a 10-centimeter long sandeel than a 3-millimeter long copepod? But this correlation suggests a really large-scale basin spanning dependency, almost like a short circuit across the food chain that supports the kittiwakes on the Isle of May, and means that the local view, focused only on the breeding season, is missing a really large piece of these creatures' lives. Another way to think about problems of scale, I suppose, beyond spatial scale, is to think about the scale difference between populations and individuals. I've been really struck by the fact, as I've started to learn more about seabird biology, that often when we talk about food insecurity, not having good quality sandeels to eat, you have to understand the impacts of that in terms of family life, household economics, not just large scale budgets of population level consumption. So here, for example, is work showing that as the availability of forage fish declines in the North Sea, the amount of time that guillemot parents are able to spend with their chicks at home decreases because they have to go to work more often and for longer to bring home the same amount of energy. And so the implications, the impacts on the birds are coming through this aspect of family life. And that makes me think of social anthropology that tries to really understand the dynamics of complex foraging communities or other communities among humans. Here's a book that, just following the chain of references from Anna Singh, led me to, by Kathleen Miller, who's really interested in precarious livelihoods and has written this amazing social anthropological account of life among the people, the community that pick garbage out of Rio de Janeiro's garbage dump. What she's responding to is the implication, is the assumption that people would only be there on the dump if they had no other choice, and that it's not really part of normal human social relations. It's sort of a last resort. And she shows that that's not the case, that people actually have coherent reasons for coming there, choosing that line of livelihood, and for staying. And the interaction with family life and the other rhythms of human life are a big part of that. Maybe the simplest aspect of problems of scale that we face when we try to add up energy along a whole marine food chain is prey diversity. The fact that everything on a food chain like this is eating a diversity of species. They're not just eating one. So we can emphasize that salmon postmolts are dependent on sandeel, but really it varies between year and is quite unstable percentages. Here are surveys of sandeel diet around the UK and Ireland in 3 years. This is from a paper by Howland et al., 2006, showing that in 1 year they are eating mostly blue whiting. In another 2 years, they're eating mostly sandeel. Some years they eat krill, some years they eat copepods. And that is all complexity that we either need to average away or find a way to actually deal with, actually represent with data analysis and models. There is a theory of this. There is a description of this dynamic. And the word for it is precarious employment. So here is Pierre Bourdieu describing life among displaced rural Algerians in the 1950s. What happens when people are sort of required to forced out of a stable village life into cities where nothing is properly arranged? He writes, everything is stamped with precarious, no regular timetable, no fixed place of work, discontinuity in time and space, an existence swept to and fro by the whim of accident, the whole of life lived under the sign of the provisional. This is basically the definition of foraging. This is the passage that's often cited as the origin of precarity, as in precarious employment, as in the gig economy, as in making your living by driving for Uber. But it sounds to me like a pretty good definition of the standard way of life for every mobile predator in the ocean. Now, there is some theory in marine ecology, general ecology, of how should we think about the pattern of dependence on a diversity of unpredictable patchy resources, which I think you could call the definition, literally, of foraging as opposed to whatever the opposite of foraging is, maybe harvesting. The theory that I have found that tries to deal with this in general is the portfolio effect. There's a review paper here by Daniel Schindler. It's a theory that was developed at first, I think, by Dunbar in 1968. It's sort of a classic idea that when you have a shared dependence on a diversity of resources, you never know where your next meal is coming from, but you're able to eat many different things. That the way to theorize that is like a diversified investment portfolio. That instead of focusing on the changes in exactly one prey item, you add them all together, and the sheer diversity of your resources lends resilience to a picture that otherwise would seem really unstable. Now, reading this bit of theory in the context of the books I've cited by Anna Singh, Kathleen Miller, made me think about the contrast between a diversified investment portfolio and employment in a gig economy. Because structurally speaking, they're both quite similar. You have the potential for financial gain from a variety of sources. They're all quite unpredictable. If you average them together, you get something smoother than any of the individuals. But these two metaphors, these two human metaphors for what foraging is like, an investment portfolio and gig employment, the connotation of them is exactly opposite when it comes to resilience or vulnerability under a changing environment. I think I don't have a way of resolving that conflict, but I think it's worth paying attention to. And I think that this question of when does the diversity of resources that a forager depends on lend it additional resilience? When does it lend it additional vulnerability is something that we could try to generalize and theorize. So let's see if any of that adds up to some glimpses of resilience under the large-scale picture of despair I showed you a moment ago. There's another passage from Singh about this idea of precarity. We hear about precarity every day. People lose their jobs. Gorillas and river porpoises hover at the edge of extinction. Insert examples about salmon and seabirds here. But most of the time, we imagine such precarity to be an exception to how the world works. It's what drops out from the system. The system here, in this context, meaning industrial patterns of production, macroeconomics, production and consumption. But she says, what if precarity, indeterminacy, and what we imagine as trivial are the center of the systematicity we seek? The implication is that the impossible to generalize livelihoods like matsutake mushroom foraging that we normally discard as too idiosyncratic to scale up, taken together are what future resilience will look like. I find this a really powerful vision of the future. I mean, as a human being and as an ecologist. And what I want to do with the remaining time is just give you some starting points or some glimpses of how we try to translate that approach of centering things that we could otherwise dismiss as trivial or needing to be averaged away, centering those things in our models. So a project that we've been working on for a while and are expanding now, the new PhD student, Alex Winter, who just joined us, is trying to create a general model of this set of arrows in the very center of the food between a diversity of zooplankton and a few populations of very widely distributed forage fish. with a focus on modeling the arrow, the transfer of energy, rather than any of the individual species involved. This is the diet of an origami sandeel, or the diet of a real sandeel rendered in paper and blown up by a factor of 50. So this is what the continuous plankton recorder units. There's tiny Oithona, there's large copepods. This is quite a small northern krill. And this is what a sandeel is dependent on or searching for. Now, so far, when I've shown you results on zooplankton, what we were doing was taking a list of species, that's it, and just adding it all together in units. Now, packaged, you have many small individuals or one large one that have the same number of kilojoules of energy in them. But from the point of view of a forage fish considered as an actual forager with work to do and the need to find something to eat in a big confusing ocean, it matters quite a lot how visible, how big each prey that you're targeting is. So inspired by this, Agnes Olin, in a paper that's in press right now, put together a model of first summer growth in sandeels around the North Sea. So it takes zooplankton data from the continuous plankton recorder, we run the model, and it predicts the length of the sandeel after its first summer, in its first winter, overwintering, overwinter survival, and the rest of its life too. It's a quite complicated model because it's trying to capture the diversity of prey, that size spectrum of copepods, dynamics of things in a semi-relative density of things at each unit of time. How daily behavior and metabolism affect your strategy, and then finally some of the individual bioenergetic budget of gains versus losses and so on. So it's quite complicated. I'm certainly not going to go through the particulars here, but I just want to note that I think the motivation for this really complicated model of foraging dynamics is quite similar to the motivation for social trying to really get inside the lives of a ephemeral picking mushrooms in the forest or in the garbage dump. I think we're to capture the same multi-level complexity of the foragers' lives because we don't know a priori which of those levels is really going to set the shape of the story. The model works pretty well. It does correctly identify the places in the North Sea where sandeels tend to be small and where they are getting smaller over time. That's good. But more than that, it actually gives different output than the simple zooplankton index where we just add everything together. So what I've done here is plot many years for 4 different sandeel grounds around the North Sea. This is from Agnes's paper. On the x-axis is where we simply take the diversity of zooplankton, add them together in energy units. And the vertical axis is where we run about how a sandeel finds something to eat, how it decides what to eat, when it decides it's full, and so on. If it made no difference, you'd see a simple line, a straight line, or maybe a saturating curve running through this figure. And you do see correlations, of course, more food, more growth. But you can see that there's quite a lot of scatter between years, quite a lot of biases between sites, and that has to do with the fact that the way in which the zooplankton are packaged really does make a difference. So that gives us some faith that we're onto something, trying to resolve this level of detail. A parallel project, work by Iselin Borland, who I see is on the in the audience today, simulating the navigation decisions by the post-smolts as they're leaving all the rivers around the UK and Ireland and trying to make their way to the Norwegian Sea for their first summer. The method here is particle tracking in the high-resolution Scottish shelf model reanalysis. You can see the triangular mesh of that model grid in the background, along with 3 behaviors that the salmon are allowed to use in combination, whatever works for them in their particular side of the UK, as a way of making it around the coast, following whatever cues are available to them locally and onto Norway. It's a really nice context in which to be thinking about the portfolio effect and its limits, but in a practical sense, to bring this back to the problems that I started with, it lets us define a footprint for the salmon from each river in the UK, a guess at which particular piece of the coastal ocean they're going to be using. And it's often what we would expect, but not always. For example, here are fish from the Tamar River, down on the south coast of the UK. You can see that because of the complexity of finding a good cue that you could use to find your way across the shelf and out into the currents that'll take you straight onto Norway, in the model, they end up covering really quite a lot of ground, trying this way and that way. But we can take these footprints, compare them with our large-scale picture of zooplankton decline. And what we find is, I think, what you could call small-scale partial refugia, where against the background of really large-scale wipeout of that population of zooplankton, there are a couple of these 6 test rivers where the decline is significantly less in our projections for the 2040s. And really, it's the rivers, it's not the rivers that have the most exposure to really high value open ocean large zooplankton like Calanus. I would say it seems to be, from the sample of 6 that we're going to expand soon, it's the rivers where the fish are spending a lot more time in the shelf seas and never really had that much exposure to really high value prey in the first place. Those are places where we might find future resilience. On another level, we might be looking too narrowly at the diet entirely. I think we have to think about how flexible and creative sandeels are willing to be about what they eat. They may have to eat something different in the 21st century than what they traditionally ate in the 20th. And we don't know yet, really, to what extent they're willing to do that. So we started a slow motion project with Connie Jaspers at DTU in Copenhagen, who is an expert on larvaceans. Here's a larvation. Larvation is a tunicate, so close relative of ours, actually, closer relatives than krill. They are tiny, they're planktonic, they build jelly houses to filter out phytoplankton that other things won't eat, and they are on the rise. At the same time, all the crustacean plankton seems to be declining. And here, just for an analogy that maybe is even more spurious than the ones I've been telling you, is another tunicate. This is Siona. It's invasive. It grows on rocks and pilings. You find it all around northern seas. It's invasive, but it's good for water quality because it's a filter feeder. So, gelatinous food of the future. That the analogy that maybe is unfair, or maybe actually is just how we should be thinking, is we may have to be as creative as the sandeels, of course, about what we eat. We think about food security and food sustainability. And I was really heartened to see this story in The Guardian from last year, where a lab in Norway that was trying to turn Siona into fish meal for aquaculture just found that their samples in the lab smelled so good, they couldn't resist. And they realized it makes really delicious non-mammal burgers. So as an attempt at a framework to sum up all of these little bits and pieces I've been telling you about, I think maybe we should look for places where we think about the ocean and food webs in terms of harvesting when we should be thinking about them in terms of foraging. And what I mean by that pair of terms is, in the harvesting view, we think about straightforward responses to the resources. The resource grows, you harvest it, you're doing well. It's a sort of macroeconomic view of ecology, where we talk about ideas very familiar in our theory, like maximum sustainable yield, net production, all of these sort of large industrial farming metaphors for a wild ecosystem. But just changing our language, our set of concepts to foraging makes a person think about patchworks of resources in space and time and species, the plasticity of behavior it takes to find food, the fact that we may not be sure what is trash and what is treasure in the food web, individual constraints, search and sensing, information constraints, and how gain and risk balance with each other. It really gives agency to the nodes in the chain, and I think builds up a much richer picture to the extent we're able to. So finally, I'll just end with this quote from Anna Singh, that neither tales of progress nor of ruin tell us how to think about collaborative survival. It's time to pay attention to, in her case, mushroom picking, and in this case, possibly salmon, seabirds, and plankton. Not that this will save us, but it might open our imaginations. So final thing, I just want to highlight a couple of events coming up if you'd like to continue this conversation past today. The Migration and Prey Energyscapes Working Group of MAST is going to have a science workshop as part of the MAST annual science meeting on November 20th. Registration's open for a few more days. You could always get in touch with us after the fact as well. And we'd really like to welcome new members and expand the range of problems that we consider over the next year. And if you would like something slightly less technical, or technical in a different way, we're going to have a plankton origami drop-in session with the bar open at the Glasgow Art Club on the evening of 18th November, which is the first day of the MAST's annual science meeting, but open to all. And that's co-hosted by Waterways, an art science collective that also has been helping shape my thinking about this work. So please get in touch. And in the meantime, I will stop sharing and look forward to your questions.